Okay, so chapter 24. Every chapter of Tanya just brings more and more beautiful concepts and illuminations. Each one is more beautiful than the next. So it's like I start every chapter with the same introduction. Oh, this chapter is really beautiful. And the next chapter is really beautiful. So chapter 24 segues, obviously, from chapter 23, where chapter 23, we learned about the effect of doing a mitzvah and specifically studying Torah, which causes a unity with Hashem, and in the case of studying Torah, creates a complete oneness with Hashem, because Torah is even more than the will of Hashem. It is Hashem himself, right? So how did we actually get onto this topic is because we have been all the way from chapter 18, we have been discussing the natural love that every single Jew has, which has to be awakened or revealed, and that this natural love comes from the same place, and can actually be interchanged with the concept of faith, or the concept of emunah. So this natural love comes from the place of faith, emunah. And why are we discussing chapter 18 now? Because belief in Hashem is represented by doing a mitzvah. So in other words, belief in Hashem is represented by the 248 positive mitzvahs. In other words, when you awaken and reveal this hidden love and faith for Hashem, you are able then to do the 248 mitzvahs easily, right? Because the whole of Tanya is based on the fact that it should be easy, accessible, relevant for us, okay? And the opposite is also true. When one transgresses one of the 365 prohibitions, this chapter is going to now explain to us actually what happens is the opposite of what happens when we do a mitzvah. Now, this chapter actually brings awareness. It's not to scare us. It's actually to bring awareness and to alert us to the opportunity inherent in performing the mitzvahs and actually not doing the sin, not sinning. So the previous chapter, we expressed how we achieve unity and oneness with Hashem through studying Torah, through performing the mitzvahs. And this chapter will explain how sinning, and maybe not even sinning, but by clothing our animal soul in thought, speech, and action of sin. So you may be even thinking about sin. You may have not actually sinned, but you may have just thought about sinning, how that can cause separation from this unity of Hashem, separation from this oneness, and actually entails denying Hashem's existence or negating Hashem's existence. Okay, so again, something very interesting we're going to learn about klipa in this chapter. Let's remember that klipa, which is literally translated as a shell, right? A shell protects or covers that which is within, right? So klipa conceals godliness, and as a result, klipa feels like it has its own independent existence, separate from God, right? When a person sins, he sins with his animal soul. Now, his animal soul, a Jew's animal soul, originates not from the three completely impure klippas, right? Because there are different levels of klippa. When a person sins, he takes his animal soul, which originates in something called klippas noiga, which is a translucent klippa. Yes, it conceals godliness, but kind of, it's like as if you're looking at a light through a translucent or a frosted window. You do see that there's a light behind, it's not completely opaque. So our animal soul is kind of malleable. It's neutral. It comes from klippas noiga. It does not come from holiness. It does not reveal godliness automatically like our divine soul does. However, when a person uses his animal soul, which is enclosed in the body, so we are using our body, our thought, speech, and action of our body to sin, we are then not uniting with Hashem, but uniting with Klippa. And here's the punchline of this chapter. Not only does a person unite with Klippa, you unite your animal soul with negative forces, but your animal soul now becomes even lower than klipa. It descends to a level lower than the most impure concealment of godliness. And we're going to explain why that is. Why do we descend lower? Now, just to remind you also, we mentioned this in last chapter briefly. I'm going to mention it briefly over here, and in next chapter is going to go into it in depth. But in the same way as when a person sins, his animal soul descends even lower than its source, lower than klipa. In the same way, when a person does a mitzvah, his soul then becomes elevated to a place higher than it itself. In other words, the soul goes to a higher place than the source, the godly source of the soul itself. Okay, so now why, when a person sins, does its animal soul, or the expression of its animal soul through thought, speech, and action, how does that go to a place that's even lower than klipa, which conceals godliness? So klipa itself, when it is created, not in any physical, corporeal body, not in an animal. So, for example, the animals which we are prohibited to eat come from klipa. Not in any body. Klipa has not descended yet in a body. It actually knows Hashem and knows its mission. Klipa has a mission. Hashem created it. We have discussed this in the past, that Hashem doesn't love klipa, but it loves what it can achieve. Hashem only tolerates klipa as a means to an end. Klipa was created with a very specific mission in mind. The mission is to present the Jew with a choice of either sinning or withstanding temptation and not sinning. When the person withstands temptation and doesn't sin, klipa has fulfilled its mission. But before it becomes into a physical body, it cannot completely negate Hashem, because it knows what its life force is. It does deny Hashem's exclusivity, right? Which is why klipa considers Hashem the God of gods, because klipa itself feels like it's a god. It knows from where it gets its vitality. It has a very limited godly vitality. It does know where it comes from. It does not negate godliness, but it just feels kind of independent, much like that teenager we've spoken about in the past. He knows who his parents are. And sometimes when his connection with his parents is threatened, he will reinforce that connection. But usually, the teenager likes to feel independent, his own person, may even seemingly rebel against his parents. And klipa is in the same way. It knows where it comes from. It knows where it comes from. It doesn't negate Hashem. It negates Hashem's exclusivity. But once it goes into a physical body, and the person who has free choice sins, that person is going against Hashem's will. And therefore, at the moment of sin, and I want to emphasize this moment because it's not permanent, at the moment of sin, the person descends to a level even lower than klipa. He denies Hashem's unity even more than klipa itself. So why does a person sin? You have to be crazy to sin. And that's exactly the reason a person sins. A spirit of insanity. Tanya calls it a spirit of folly. A ruach shtus enters a person, and thereby he or she is able to sin. And the example is given both in the Tanya and in the Tanya the Alter Rebbe brings the source of the Gemara. The example is given of an adulteress, a woman who commits adultery. This same woman who gets carried away with her passion, this same woman would be willing to sacrifice her life, right? She would be willing to die rather than negate Hashem's oneness. If someone would come to this woman who sins through adultery, she's swept up in her passion, and would ask her to deny Hashem's existence or die, she would rather die. She is capable of sacrificing her life rather than negating Hashem's existence. So you could think that she was carried away with her passion, and the Gemara tells us no. It's actually insanity that causes her to sin in the way of adultery. Because if it wasn't for insanity, she would be able to control her passion, much like she would be able to die for the sake of not negating Hashem's will, because dying is much worse than withstanding temptation of adultery. It's a much tougher thing to die than to not commit adultery, to withstand your temptation, right? It's less suffering. Withholding yourself from a temptation is much less suffering than dying. And yet, she is able to sacrifice her life rather than negate Hashem's existence, and yet she sins. Why does she sin? Because of spirit of insanity, of folly entered her. And the reason why she's able to die and not negate Hashem is because this spirit of insanity affects every single part of our godly soul except for Chachma. Remember, we have Chachma, Bina, Das, etc., Chesed, Gvura, etc. So Chachma, the level of Chachma, which is above rationalization, it is the place from where Emunah comes. It is the place where the hidden love we have inherited from our patriarchs, that is where it is found. The spirit of insanity does not affect Chachma. That is the place of our faith. And that is why a person is able to die al Kiddush Hashem, would rather die than negate Hashem's existence, but occasionally will sin because of a spirit of insanity. But the spirit of insanity does not affect the level of Chachma. Now, this spirit of insanity actually causes her, what does it cause her to do? It causes a person to distinguish. So in the case of the adulteress, which the Alter Rebbe brings as an example, it causes her to distinguish between adultery and idolatry, thinking in her mind that idolatry is much worse. Avodah Zarah is a much worse sin. So therefore, that sin I won't commit. But this sin is not as bad. And we also make this rationale on a daily basis, on a momentary basis, and that is why we are able to sin, because we think that one sin is not as bad as another sin, right? However, even a so-called minor sin causes a person to be separated from Hashem, causes a person to be separated from Hashem's oneness and unity, and causes a person to descend to a level which is lower than Klippa itself. It causes a person to descend to a level that is lower than the source of his animal soul. Because Klippa does not violate Hashem's will. The person violates Hashem's will. The expression of the soul violates Hashem's will. And when a person sins, he becomes lower than Klippa. He becomes lower than all creations which stem from Klippa. So your animal soul comes from Klippa. All prohibited animals, which we are prohibited to eat, unkosher animals and reptiles, also their source is also Klippa, because they are prohibited to us, right? Which is why, very interesting, the Gemara tells us that when a person sins, he should remember that a mosquito was created before him. In other words, he is now lower than a mosquito. Now, the Alter Rebbe explains, why does the Gemara bring the example of a mosquito exactly? What's so unique about a mosquito? There are lots of animals that are unkosher and prohibited, and right? Why the mosquito? Why are we talking about a mosquito? So a mosquito is a very interesting insect. A mosquito takes, but does not excrete. Did you know that? A mosquito will bite, will sting a person, will take their blood. A mosquito does not excrete anything, but it will not excrete to the point of death. In other words, once a mosquito has had its fill of a human's blood, mosquito will die. So a mosquito is really very selfish. The mosquito takes, does not give, and then dies. He rather dies than give out, than excrete, right? So in this mushal, in this parable, the excrement is being compared to giving. He takes the person's blood. He does not give anything out into the world, because actually the excrement of animals serve a purpose in this world. It does not excrete to the point of death. Once it's had its fill, it dies. So when a person is so selfish, selfishly sins, because a ruach shtus entered his mind, he thinks that, oh, this sin is not so bad. It doesn't disconnect me so much from Hashem. And he forgets how connected he is with God, and he starts distinguishing between different sins. That is the spirit of insanity. He then lowers himself lower than the source of his animal soul, lower than the source of prohibited animals, even a mosquito, because animals and beasts do not violate Hashem's inner will. Maybe not consciously, but the spirit with which they are created does not violate Hashem's inner will. In fact, animals, the Gemara tells us, fear humans unless the human appears as an animal, which is a very interesting statement. And we are proven this by the story in Tanakh of Daniel, the prophet, who was thrown into the lion's den. He was a tzaddik, so he appeared to be as a real human, not as an animal. He was completely in alignment with Hashem's will, appeared to be as a human being should appear to be, which is the purpose of all of our existence. And because he appeared to be in alignment with Hashem's will, a real human being serving his purpose, the lions did not attack him. Not only did the lions not attack him, they stood humbly by. They were humbled by Daniel in the lion's den, right? However, let's just pause and let's ask the question, which the Alter Rebbe does raise in this chapter. Some sins do seem to be more grave than other sins, and there does apparently seem to be a hierarchy of sins, or on the contrary, mitzvahs. And one example that is given is in keeping Shabbos. So we do know that saving a person's life supersedes keeping Shabbos, right? So if a person is in danger of dying, you are allowed to desecrate Shabbos in order that the person should live. So the Alter Rebbe explains in this particular example that we have to understand that it's not that life takes precedence over Shabbos. We're not saying that life itself is more important than Shabbos, but we are saying that the fulfillment of keeping all the other Shabbosim in the person's life supersedes desecrating this one Shabbos. In other words, we cannot say that Shabbos is more important than life, because if the person dies, then he can't keep any other Shabbos in his life. So we are saying that this represents that the keeping of Shabbos is more important than dying, because this Shabbos you may not keep because you're in danger of your life, but this, because we are saving your life, you will be able to keep many other Shabbosim in your life, right? But we also do know that there are three mitzvahs which fall into the category of yaroig v'lo yavor. In other words, if a person is presented with the temptation or opportunity to sin in three mitzvahs, which is idolatry, incest, and murder, a person should rather die than actually commit these sins, right? Which is not like this in the case of Shabbos. So it appears to us that perhaps these are graver sins, maybe, right? However, the Alter Rebbe explains that the consequences, or the punishment thereafter, may be different. But at the moment of sin, all sins are equal in the fact that they sever one's connection, they weaker one's connection with Hashem. Chaisara just asked the question if we're allowed to save a non-Jew's life on Shabbos. I actually don't know the answer to that question. And I'm sure that the answer lies in, it depends on the circumstances. I really don't know. I would have to look into that. I don't know. I'm sure that people who are doctors or nurses or whatever, they have certain obligations. I don't know the intricacies of that at all. Right? So there are different consequences for sins. And the reason there are different consequences for sins does not mean that one sin is worse than the other. It just means that they affect the soul differently, and therefore the cleansing of the soul will therefore be different. But the effect on the soul, on the person, is the same, whether it's a minor sin or a so-called grave sin. The effect of on the person is that your connection with Hashem is weakened. There are certain sins, however, which come with the consequence of kares, which means cutting the person off from Hashem completely. That is a different category. But in the case where the connection with Hashem is severed, there is also the opportunity to reconnect thereafter. We're going to talk about that in a second. Just going back to the 3 mitzvahs, which a person should rather die than commit the sin, that is actually part of Hashem's will as part of the mitzvah. It doesn't necessarily indicate that it's a worse or more graver sin or a minor sin, or, that is actually part of the will of Hashem, which Tanya actually says it's gezeras hakasuv. It's something that we don't entirely understand. It's part of Hashem's will. But going back to the opportunity that arises when a person sins, right? When a person sins, he lowers his soul into a level even lower than Klippa itself, right? But he is able through tshuva, through repenting, to rise out of this level. Because why was he at this level in the first place? Why did he sin in the first place? Because within your body, your divine soul is in exile. It's imprisoned. It's very limited. It doesn't have all the tools at its disposal in a revealed way at all times. The body, as we know, the body dominates most of the time, especially with a Russia. The body dominates the person mostly, and we have to extricate through tshuva or through withstanding temptation the godly soul from its prison within the animal soul. So there is no greater exile for the neshama, which comes from a very, very high place, to go to such a lowly place as to commit a sin which is equal to idolatry, which is negating Hashem's oneness, right? And actually, the example as Alter Rebbe gives is, it says, when you sin, it says if you're taking the king's head, which is a very high, lofty place, and you're plunging it into filth. However, even for a moment, right? It's not permanent. It's at the moment of sin. Because as we know, all this is really not linear. You could sin in one moment and do a mitzvah the next moment, right? So it's not linear. It's not like you've permanently blemished yourself. But at the moment of sin, it's as if you're plunging your neshama even worse into this exile, and even deeper into the pit, and even deeper into the filth, right? So what is this? What is the purpose of this chapter? What is the purpose of this chapter? So I think Shalom is asked, what is this Ruach Shtus? Well, the Ruach Shtus comes from Klippa. Awareness prevents us from knowingly sinning, and prevents us from involuntary falling into the hands of the spirit of folly. Because if we are not aware of the spirit of folly, we actually don't have pure free choice. If we are aware of it, we can stop ourselves, and we can remind ourselves, especially through contemplating the Tanya, these words of the Tanya, that no, it is not just a small severing. It's not just a minor disconnection from Hashem, but that every single sin that we do is weakening our connection from Hashem. That will hopefully prevent us from sinning. So It gives us an awareness. It also shows us the opportunities we have through withstanding temptation or through doing tshuva for a sin, right? And what will be gone into more depth in the next chapter, and that's how I want to end off this class, is that something very, very interesting about sinning is that, yes, when a person sins, and we may sin numerous times a day, and we do mitzvahs numerous times a day as well, when a person sins, you do lower yourself, you do lower your thought, speech, and action to a place lower than your actual soul, a place lower than klippa, the dregs, like Tanya calls this world, this physical world in which we live, like the dregs at the bottom of a bottle of wine. It's like the klippa of the klippa. It's like very, 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 very lowly place, right? Yes, that is true. However, there is an intrinsic difference between sinning and doing a mitzvah. When we sin, even though we go to this lowly, lowly place, we are able to extricate ourselves from there by doing tshuva. In other words, a sin is not permanent. A sin, you can eradicate the effects of a sin. You can even eradicate the sin itself by doing tshuva out of love. However, doing a mitzvah is eternal. You can never eradicate the effects of doing a mitzvah. And that's the difference between sinning and doing a mitzvah. That's the advantage, actually, of performing a mitzvah over sinning. So we want to prevent the sinning in the first place, but we do know that if a person does sin, he does have the opportunity to extricate himself. And next chapter is going to go back to the mitzvahs. So this chapter is just to create an awareness of what can happen, and this awareness reminds you, because when we sin, we actually forget about our connection. We convince ourselves through the spirit of folly that it's not so bad. And that's what the spirit of folly is all about. Okay, any questions, observations?
I didn't understand. Where does this Rochstus come from?
Where does it come from? I
You
don't
walk
know.
on the street and all of a sudden you feel like crossing on the red light. Like, where is it coming from?
Probably from your Yetzer Hara. Your Yetzer Hara is the emotional part of your animal soul. So this spirit of insanity, if it's not clear, it comes from lack of clarity. That's where it really comes from. It comes from lack of clarity, because when you are when you are about to jump out of a window because a fire is raging in your home, that's very clear that you have to save your life, right? So when a person is presented with an opportunity to die, sacrifice his life, al kiddush Hashem, instead of negating Hashem's existence, that's very clear, and that's at the level of chachma. That the spirit of folly does not affect that part. Doesn't affect clarity. The Ruach Shtus enters us as a result of lack of clarity, as a result of confusion, as a result of Klippa taking over. And this is what this chapter of Tanya seeks to achieve, to bring us greater clarity to counteract that Ruach Shtus. It's insane. Much like the adulteress who sins, she's convincing herself that it's not as bad. But actually, yes, if she would stop to think that by sinning in the way of adultery is causing her the same kind of separation from Hashem as idolatry, then she would be able to withstand her temptation, which is much easier than dying. A person who's going to get swept up with passion and would rather die than negating Hashem is just an insane person. It's insanity, according to Tanya. But that's an extreme example. The Alter Rebbe brings an extreme example to bring this point home.
But doesn't it say that this adulteress, she wants, like, she's seducing someone? Maybe my English
that's
is
different. No, that's a different example. That's a different example. That's not the example of seducing. That's in the Tanya brings that example in a different place, where a king uses an adulteress to seduce his son to prove that his son is faithful. And then the seducer is actually happy when the son withstands. So yes, in the same case, the Yetzer Hara Klippa has a mission to fulfill and is actually happy when we withstand its temptation. Yes, because that's its mission. It doesn't want you. Klippa doesn't want you to sin. Klippa wants you to withstand the temptation. That's in a different place.
Okay.
Okay. So any takeaways before we sign off?
It's scary.
No, so it's scary. Well, a little bit of fear is useful, right? But it shouldn't bring to shame and an overabundance of guilt. It's just an awareness that Tanya is bringing, right? Because shame and, oh, it's too scary, and this overload of guilt, that actually comes from the Yetzer Hara, clothed in holy, like a tzaddik. Oh, you should feel so much shame and so much guilt. Tanya itself emphasizes in this chapter that it's momentary. So yes, you do go to this low level, but it's only for the moment of sinning. Next moment, you could do a mitzvah and unite with Hashem.
But I understand the person's sin as a moment, but the outcome of the sin could be a lifelong problem.
Well, but that's what we have tshuva for. And that's what the awareness brings. You can't do tshuva without awareness.
No, I'm saying like this person was married to a non-Jewish person and he has a child, and now his whole life is attached to this past.
Right, yeah.
He cannot disconnect from. He has responsibilities.
Yes.
I'm saying certain sins are not, and that's
certain sins cause effects in this world. Yes, agreed. And therefore the tshuva is harder or greater or yeah. Okay, ladies, have a great day.
Thank you.